So you're here because you don't want to play a fire deck. And I can totally understand that, even though Fire King Snake Eye is looking to be the best deck or one of the best decks of the next format following the Phantom Nightmare release, a lot of players just don't want to play a tier 0 deck, or simply and understandably don't have the budget for all these really expensive cards. Bonfire being an $80 to $90 ultra rare out of Maze of Millennia, the Wanted engine, which requires you to play $300 plus quick play spell cards in Wanted, Seeker of Sinful Spoils, and of course the new Snake Eye Poplar, an ultra rare that is already around $50 in addition to the Promethean Princess Bestower of Flames that you probably need 2 of, also around $40 to $50. That is a very small engine for a lot of money. But thankfully, I think this format is going to be balanced like the one before it. A lot of viable decks, a lot of weird, roguish decks making top cut because everything is pretty much open and there's no one deck to rule them all. So in this video, I want to break down a few of those decks that you could use, play, and see competitive success as they have, because these are topping decks on a budget. Starting off with, surprisingly enough, Super Heavy Samurai. Super Heavy Samurai has seen a lot of competitive success and was a very powerful deck in the last national season, but the banning of the Link 1 Scarecrow really hurt the deck. But the engine itself is pretty much unhurt, and one Wakashi can do a lot of crazy things. And this is exactly what Gianluca De Luigi thought when he entered the regional in Foggia with Super Heavy Samurai. Now, as you can see from the deck, we have our usual suspects, and we're playing a pretty heavy Super Heavy Samurai engine with 3 Soul Gaia Booster, 3 Wakashi, 3 Bike, and of course 3 Soul Piercer. So pretty much half of the deck is just dedicated to the Super Heavy engine. And of course, since this deck cannot play any spell cards, we're seeing a lot of non-engine as well. We have Regulus to provide us with a negate, but also Fenrir's, Veilers, we even have 1 Gamma, Ash, Bell, and Mourner. This is how you know you have a lot of non-engine slots. Now in the extra deck, again, the usual suspects, some Omni Negates, some Extenders, and while this looks like a pretty cookie cutter list, this deck provides a lot of interruption, leaving you at the end of your combo with at least a Baron, an SP Little Knight, and an Apollosa. And of course in the side deck, we're also seeing a pretty cool tech choice in Psyframe Gear Delta that can actually negate spell activations using the Psyframe Gear engine. Now this list ended up taking top 4 at that regional, and this deck is relatively budget. This deck cost $382, which is again less than the Sinful Spoils engine combined. Now speaking of Italian tournaments, we have a top 4 deck list from the Italian Open piloted by Aimee Michel that cost $326 altogether. And this is of course Runic Sprite for Hire, a deck that has proven itself time and time again to be a very strong contender, even though Runic decks, or even Sprite decks rather, have fallen out of favor a little bit during the past format. This deck can still do a lot, drawing an insane amount of cards and just grinding like crazy, like no other deck can possibly do. And with the Sprite engine hopefully getting a reprint soon, this deck will become significantly cheaper in the near future. Now, considering the Runic engine just got a reprint in the tins, and of course cards like Fossil Dig got an awesome bunch of reprints in the Rarity Collection, and as seen, taking top 4 in the Italian Open can really grind with the best of them. Now this deck is way cheap. This deck is Tenny Sword Soul, costing only $114. Piloted by Enzo Demeretz in the Nimes WCQ Regional, taking up the 2nd spot, with a deck that costs almost like 1 Wanted Seeker of Sinful Spoils. Now this deck has all the usual suspects, and the Sword Soul engine getting the reprints it got in Magnificent Mavens is extremely cheap, alongside the Tennies that were reprinted in the last Ghosts from the Past that are also very cheap. Playing 3 Dimension Shifter in the main, really strong, and relying on the sort of newly released Denglong to get an additional Omni Negate on the field with 9 Pillars of the Yang Zing. Now Sword Soul has always been a fan favorite because this deck is at full power, and besides losing cards like Auroradon and Protoss that weren't actually a part of the strategy, this deck has all the cards going for it. And of course, being able to utilize a lot of non-engine slots, Desires at 3, and of course Dimension Shifter, Droll, and most importantly Anti-Spell Fragrance, it's easy to see why this deck took the 2nd place at that regional. And with a price tag of basically 1 Wanted Seeker of Sinful Spoils, you cannot deny that this is a budget deck. Speaking of favorites, going into the Fire King Snake Eye format, one contender that I'm always recommending to people without too much personal bias is Branded Espia. This deck, piloted by David Eisliner, taking down the top 8 spot of the Austrian Open a few weeks ago, costs $352. Again, basically a wanted engine. Now this deck has a 57 card list, and most of the cards are extremely cheap that have gotten reprints very recently. Basically the only expensive card here is Guiding Quem the Virtuous. Now this deck has a lot going for it because it has a really good Fire King Snake Eye matchup. It doesn't care about removal, and it has good non-targeting removal on its side with Albaz and Mirror Jade. Now, being able to play things like Thrust, Talents, and of course Super Polymerization really easily deals with the all-fire end board from the Fire King side. And altogether, Super Polymerization is just an extremely strong card that not a lot of decks can run. With some more notable tech choices in the side deck like Branded Banishment for the Mirror, Lightning Storm, Guilty Gearfried as a Super Polymerization target for SP Little Knight and Baron, it's easy to see why this deck is still very good. 3 Branded Fusion, 3 Opening, 3 Aluber, the engine is basically intact, and if Fire King Snake Eye reigns supreme, Branded is going to be chasing its tail. And another Branded variant that is even cheaper and saw better success at the Austrian Open is the top 4 Branded Chimera list that costs $242. Piloted by Wolfgang Schmidt, this is a pretty standard Chimera build, but Chimera, again relying on the Branded engine to provide an additional 1-card combo for the deck, can play a lot of non-engine slots. It's very easy to OTK with this deck, and again, using cards like Super Polymerization and the newly released Tau the Chanter, this deck can do a lot. Now in the side deck, we are seeing some important tech choices for a lot of matchups, like the End of Anubis to deal with decks like Tierliament or even now Fire King, and King Tiger Wanghu, which honestly also deals well with things like Sprite, but also the Fire King and Snake Eye cards that all have really low attack stats. Now this deck has been a favorite of mine. I took down 2 tops at the regional season in Duelist Nexus, and I really enjoy this deck, and with the budget on this build, it's really easy to see why people are gravitating towards Chimera. And lastly, I do want to talk about a Tierliament list. Now, Tierliament do play Horus a lot more recently, and the Horus engine is expensive. But Paulo da Silva in the Sao Paulo Regional actually managed to win the entire event without using the Horus engine at all. Playing a more danger Tierliament hero list, he did play a lot of dangers, 2 Destrudos, some Castro Fenriers, and a lot of Tierliment's cards. And yeah, even though the Horus engine gives you great access to things like Zombie Vampire, which is important to this deck, the dangers seemingly do a lot as well. Now, surprisingly enough, this deck runs in the main deck Droll and Lockbird. Usually Tierliment's has about 3 to 5 non-engine slots, and it's interesting to see the 3 non-engine slots in the main deck for Drolls. But it also allows them to gain additional access to cards like Selene and Access Code, which you don't usually see in Tierliment's builds. Now, you can draw the Droll and activate it, but you can also mill the Droll, which gives you a Selene that is live and can go up to a 5300 attack Access Code. And of course, cards like Volcanic Scattershot are just funny. So these have been a few decks that are actually on or below the price of one Sinful Spoils Wanted engine. And it's kind of funny because these decks are seeing a lot of success, and the top cuts are still super varied in terms of deck strategy. And with all these decks taking up top 8 and above, I think it's safe to say that you definitely don't have to play Fire this format. Thank you so much for watching. Leave a like, leave a comment below. What is your budget deck choice for this upcoming format? And I will see you in the next one.